So this morning we are starting a series on Genesis. Again, this will be a familiar book to most of you, but remember there's always something new we can learn. And I guess the overarching theme through Genesis, or the question we hope to answer, how can we have hope? There was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald just a couple of months ago by Amanda Vanstone. I don't know whether that's how you say her name or not, but she was a former Howard government minister. And she said this: from a layman's perspective, I think we, and especially young people, would be much healthier in mind and spirit if we were able to be more aware of the good things that are happening. This is not a plea for Pollyanna stories. Mankind's endeavours in art and science are there to behold. They would give hope to many in need of a boost. Hope is the last to die. Good news gives us hope. There should be more of it. Now, I don't disagree. Great comment. I'm all for good news. But sometimes only good news is not enough. And she talks of endeavours in art and science, but these too eventually become outdated and sometimes irrelevant. And we found, particularly over this last year, that good news does not always last. Things can change rapidly. We know that lockdown can happen in a matter of hours, can't it? We have realised once again that we humans are not able to control many things, least of all our destiny. And as Steve said at the beginning, many of us have been to one or two funerals in the last 10 days. And at a funeral, at a good funeral, there are lots of good news stories of how well that person lived. But at the end of the day, they're just good news stories, and even those good news stories don't give hope when one is looking in the face of death. What we really need is hope that is not just wishful thinking, but hope based on truth and fact. And the truth of the matter is that for those of us who follow Jesus, even in death, we have a future and we have hope. But I'm getting to the end of the book. Let's go back to the very beginning, a very good place to start. Genesis, hope. How can we have hope? So the big story in Genesis is that God keeps his promise. So therefore, we can have hope. And again, Steve mentioned the Torah before, which is great. So all biblical traditions connect the Pentateuch, so the first 5 books attributed to Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Hebrew scriptures, which the order is most of the order is different from the English translation, but in the Hebrew scriptures, they also start with the Pentateuch. And we need to remember as we embark on this journey into Genesis, that this is God's story. The story of God's interaction with humans. The Bible is not focused on us as humans. Remember, the first words of the whole Bible, in the beginning, God. So this is God's story. We're not the central character in this. Now, we've got a picture here. On the bottom left is Lake Taupo, the head of the Waikato River. So we've got Taupo flowing into the river, and then the top right is Port Waikato, where it flows into the sea. Even though we think Lake Taupo is big compared to the mighty Pacific Ocean, it's still very small. And this is a great picture of the Bible. All the important ideas in Genesis, Lake Taupo, flow into an even bigger ocean of Scripture. Now that's Lewis, a quote from Lewis. Pretty cool, I thought. Whoops. Right. Is that me? Do you want me to take it off?
Oh, should be all right.
Should be right now. So, important maybe
Go back to the lectern.
go back to the next one, okay. Right. Okie dokie. So all the important ideas in Genesis flow into the ocean of Scripture. And even though when we read our English Bibles, it's written in prose, we miss a whole dimension that the Hebrew brings out, where there's beautiful symmetry. You know, day 1 in creation is parallel with day 4, and day 2 with day 5. But anyway, just wanted to highlight that the Bible is a living book which keeps on giving. No matter how many times we read it, there are new treasures to discover. Now, have you noticed in chapters 1 and 2 that God speaks and things happen? Written in the surrounding context of Israel, the nations worshipped many gods who did not speak. But the God of Israel spoke and things happened. God speaks to us. Is this the God you follow? Now, I'm not going to examine the creation story in detail. There's plenty of good material around. Thinking Matters is a great website. And I think Mike did some great YouTube interviews during lockdown last year. So that's on the Fairfield Presbyterian Parish YouTube site. And as we approach Scripture, the great question we need to ask is not how, but why. And God answers the question of why in these first couple of chapters of Genesis. Now I'm just going to look at one example. I could go on for quite a while, but we'll just limit it to one. Let's read this passage of Scripture together. Genesis 1:14 to 16 together. God said, "Let there be lights in the huge space of the sky. Let them separate the day from the night. Let the lights set the times for the holy celebrations and the days and the years. Let them be lights in the huge space of the sky to give light on earth." And that's exactly what happened. God made 2 great lights. He made the larger light to rule over the day and the smaller light to rule over the night. He also made the stars. So remember, the great question is not how, but why. So why did God make the sun, moon and stars? Well, the answer is threefold, just in this passage here. So the first reason, the greater light exists, firstly, to give light to the earth, both during the day and the night. Now we all know that the sun makes the day, and the rotation of the earth is what determines the length of the day, and the speed of the earth as it rotates determines the 24-hour duration. Yet that speed is regulated by the moon, which acts as a brake on the earth, and it restricts the speed of the rotation of the earth to the exact time that makes possible the 24-hour day, which is the length of time best adapted to the needs of humans. Isn't that remarkable? But wait, there's more. Secondly, the great lights exist to measure the process of time for days and for years. They are the means by which we measure time. The orbit of the Earth around the Sun determines the length of the year, which again is just right for human needs. But wait, there's more. Thirdly, the lights are designed to mark specific events. They're signs for seasons. The entire record of human history confirms this. This is exactly what the sun and moon and stars do. There are many times in the Bible where the sun and the moon have served as great signs. We're familiar with the Star of Bethlehem. It announced the birth of the greatest human ever born in the history of our globe. And there's also a strange darkening of the sun at his crucifixion. That's just a little bit out of Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis answers the why of creation. God's preparing for humanity. So if we were to look at an overview of Genesis, we could look at it like a play in 3 acts. So Act 1, people with purpose and hope. Act 2, creation undone, hope lost. And Act 3, God's promise leads to purpose and hope. Let's look at Act 1. People with purpose and hope. So Genesis 1 and 2 is a wonderfully condensed account of some tremendously significant things. When God made Adam, the first human, did he pile dirt together, wet it with water, and breathe life into it? We're not told exactly all the details there. But what we are told is God made the first human. He made him from the dust of the earth. And that's true. Our bodies share the similar elements that are found in the dust of the earth. What we're told here also is that humans, both male and female, are formed and made in the image of God. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Next week, Lewis will be talking more about identity. It's a great message. But what I do want to mention here is that humans, we are more than an animated piece of meat with a nervous system. We know that. We're created with a soul as well as a body. And the functions of the soul are wonderfully linked to those in the body in ways that we haven't been able even yet to understand. Then into this body, God breathed a living spirit. Now the phrase breath of life in the Hebrew means spirit of life. The word for breath and spirit are the same. So this is more than simply a picture of God breathing breath into the first human's nostrils. It's the impartation of spirit into a person. And I think it's this that distinguishes us so remarkably from the animal creation. Now, as humans came into being, we came into being as full-orbed, threefold beings: body, spirit, soul. And I think being made in God's image gives us dignity. We're made in the image of God. Therefore, every human has dignity. It also gives us responsibility. God gave humans responsibility to care for creation. We should all be interested in creation care. To care and nurture what God has entrusted to us, and capacity. We have the capacity to mirror our Creator. I mean, look at a baby at birth, right? In the first week of birth, they usually bear very little resemblance to their parents, don't they? But as they grow, a child usually resembles one or other or both parents more obviously. So for us too, as we mature as children of God, and in relationship with Him, we look more like Him. So God's image, we have dignity, responsibility and capacity. Act 2, creation undone, hope lost. So after getting off to a great start, we're not far into the story before things begin to disintegrate. The serpent beguiles the first humans, tricks them into disobedience, and there are serious consequences. All humanity inherit a sinful nature. However, with the consequences, there comes a wonderful promise of redemption and hope. Genesis 3. We have a record of Adam and Eve deliberately disobeying God and doing it their own way. Doing it their own way. They sinned and they hid. And they hid from God. Now, when Adam and Eve hid from God, what were the first words that God spoke to them after they sinned? Can you remember? What were the first words that God spoke to Adam and Eve when they hid? Where are you? Where are you? Do you seriously think that Adam and Eve were so gifted in a game of cosmic hide and seek that God couldn't find them? Of course God knew where they were. Where are you? Are words of grace and mission. God was calling lost humans back into relationship with Him. And the rest of the biblical story is about God calling lost people back into relationship with Himself. About God on mission, a mission of transforming lost people and restoring creation. And we see this promise right in Genesis 3, where God sets in motion a plan for everything to be redeemed and made new. Words of grace in the midst of judgment. God says, this is to Eve, I will make you and the woman hate each other. So he's speaking to the serpent. I will make you and the woman hate each other. Your children and her children will be enemies. Her son will crush your head and you will bite his heel. So way back at the beginning of the story, when humans mess up majorly, in the judgment there's this tremendous promise that God would redeem and restore. So God's saying to the serpent there, your children and her children will be enemies. Her son, a promise of the coming Messiah, her son will crush your head. The Messiah will deal a death blow to the serpent, but the serpent will bite his heel. There will be some damage to the Messiah. And we saw that on Calvary, didn't we? But I love this passage right at the beginning when we see hope which could have been lost. There's that kernel of a promise that God would make things right. But things continue from bad to worse. They begin badly in 3 and end badly in 11. And what happens in chapter 11? Thank you, Fiona. So if you can't remember the Tower of Babel, so this is 11, Tower of Babel, all right? 11, Tower of Babel. In chapter 11, the story becomes all about humans. They turn the spotlight on themselves and they say, let's build a tower and make a name for ourselves. We're in charge. We don't need God telling us what to do. Chapter 11 ends badly, but things are about to change. God sets in motion His great plan, His mission to redeem everything from the effects of sin. So we've got Act 1, creation. People with purpose and hope. We've got Act 2, creation undone. We could put a question mark there. Hope lost. Act 3, God's promise leads to purpose and hope. Abraham is called. So God intervenes in the history of human fallenness by choosing Abraham and his family. He steps in to initiate the unfolding of His big plan in Genesis 12. And the rest of the Bible is the unfolding of the Abrahamic covenant. And we see in God's story that those who are chosen to do God's work or be on mission with Him are not chosen because of their own goodness. They're not chosen because they're superstars. On the contrary, their flaws are part of the story. God chooses them because they trusted Him. God chooses them because they believed in the promise that God had given them. And as we get to the end of Genesis 50, we see God's people have grown in number. They're in Egypt. But the story ends with a coffin. If you remember the end of Genesis, Joseph dies. The last 5 words in Genesis, in a coffin in Egypt. However, despite this book ending in death, there is a firm hope in God continuing to fulfill his promises. Before he dies, Joseph says, "Take me with you when you go." There's a trust and there's a looking forward to the fulfillment of the covenant given in Genesis 12. So out of these 3 acts, I wonder which story you choose to live in. Do you choose to live in a story of your own making, like Act 2? Focused on making a name for yourself, building your reputation, building your future? That's a story that's bogged down by consequences, Act 2 is. Or do you want to live in Act 3? To live as one of God's people, to choose to live in God's story. To be an Act 3 person is to trust in God, even in the face of death. So I want to put my anchor in Act 3. Stop me drifting back into Act 2. Genesis points to Jesus. Jesus directly fulfills the Abrahamic covenant, the promise given in Genesis 12. Jesus directly fulfills the promise given in Genesis 3. The freedom from sin, the promise of blessing. Jesus came to bring shalom, blessing in the fullest sense, to humanity and all of creation, to bring freedom from sin, restoration of our relationship with God. Jesus fulfills the book of Genesis. And we'll see that as we go through it. Paul writes in Galatians 3, "You who belong to Christ are Abraham's seed, so you will receive what God has promised." So the theme for Genesis, God keeps his promise. Therefore, we can have hope. To be continued. To be continued. Wonderful book of Genesis. Remember, all the ideas of Genesis flow into the ocean of Scripture. So we could sing that song, Steve, My Lighthouse, and then we'll move into a time